Now, this book is gruesome. Hey guys, welcome back. I thought today I would do a video talking about some thriller recommendations. If you can tell from the title of this video, I was inspired by a podcast that I have been obsessed with for quite a while. The name of it is My Favorite Murder. And if you haven't heard of it, it's essentially about these two women who are obsessed with true crime. It's a true crime podcast. And so every week they will essentially bring to the table their favorite murder and talk about it. Obviously they go off tangent a lot. There's a lot of conversation about past murders, current murders, and then they will have people call in with their hometown murders. Anyway, it's really good, and I have been binge listening to it even more lately because we are in that fall season and Halloween is coming up. So that said, because we are entering Halloween kind of spooky season, I wanted to pass along some recommendations if you were looking for that type of spooky, thriller, murdery kind of book, either for now, or if you're just into that kind of thing and you read it all year round. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these, what you thought of them, if you have your own recommendations that you'd like to pass along. So without further ado, let's dive in. So the first book that I want to talk about is called The Skin Collector, and it's by Jeffrey Deaver. Now, I know that I have already mentioned him probably a couple of times already, but as I've mentioned before, his Lincoln Rhyme series is excellent. This book is no exception. The Skin Collector is, I believe, the 11th book in the Lincoln Rhyme series, and what it's about is Lincoln Rhymes and his partner, Amelia Sachs, are looking for a killer who is a tattoo artist. And this guy essentially goes around claiming victims by tattooing them with poison instead of ink. And so the victims always think that they survived the attack, and when they go to the police, they either die shortly after or they never make it, simply because the tattoo poison takes over them and kills them. Jeffrey Deaver does this a lot, where you will get into the mind of the killer, and it's excellent because you can understand their motive, you can see what they're thinking and their thought process, and it's just when you're wanting to go on that ride, I mean, it's great. So definitely check it out if you're into that kind of thing. The next book that I have for you is called Serial Killers by Peter Vronsky, and this one is actually a nonfiction, and it essentially examines a whole bunch of serial killers that have been chronicled throughout history. He touches on people who most of us have heard of, like Ted Bundy and Andrew Cunanan. Side note, if you haven't heard of Andrew Cunanan, I highly advise you check out The Assassination of Gianni Versace on Netflix. It's excellent, and it essentially explains who Andrew Cunanan is. So this book, Serial Killers, examines all of these serial killers and their motives. Sometimes when you're either reading a fiction book or you're watching something that's made up, it seems as if the killer is over the top and maybe a little bit too crazy to where it's detached from reality. However, this book is great because you can get a look into what actual depraved people do. He actually includes transcripts from interviews with different killers, and so it's really interesting to hear firsthand what they think about things. I think that kind of adds to the spook element. Well, not really spooky, but more that creep factor, because hearing it firsthand from the person who did all these depraved activities, I mean, it's just, it's so intriguing, you know?
Hey, Paul!
Okay, so the next one on the list is American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. Now, I'm sure the majority of you have either heard of or seen the movie with Christian Bale, who did a great job, by the way, but as usual, the book dives so much further, and it's about this white-collar rich guy, this playboy essentially, who just has to give in to that urge that he feels to murder people. He's around all of his kind of snooty rich friends. He hangs in those kind of circles, and despite the fact that he has all of this money and all of this privilege, he just can't, he needs to scratch that itch to just kill something, you know? What makes this one interesting is that it's essentially a character who, despite coming from a good upbringing and from money, he still has these urges that he can't control. Whereas in a lot of books that feature serial killers or people who end up going on a murdering rampage, they typically come from tragic backgrounds. So you don't necessarily sympathize with them, but you can definitely understand how their upbringing played a role in the things that they did when they grew up. Next on the list is Helter Skelter by Vincent Bugliosi. This one follows the Manson murders. Obviously, the name Charles Manson is very prolific and infamous on his own, and this book takes a deep dive into Manson and his followers, and essentially how he was able to not only kill people, but convince others to do the same and develop this cult following. This one, of course, is another nonfiction, but the story of Charles Manson, I feel, even though it's been done a lot, this book takes it and looks at it in a different way. I'm not sure if that is the author's voice or the way that he compiled all of the information, but I thought it was really interesting and wasn't necessarily regurgitating a lot of the facts that we already know. Now, I can't necessarily speak to the audiobook because I read the physical copy, but one difference between the two is that if you do check out the physical copy, there are a ton of photos, which usually that kind of thing doesn't interest me in books, but again, with my fascination about this topic, I thought that it was really interesting to kind of dive into the photos and look at them alongside the narrative. Next we have And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. It would be remiss of me if I didn't include the Queen of Suspense on this list, and is of course an older mystery book. However, I still think it deserves a place on this list simply because it was so brilliantly written. Agatha Christie herself is the dame of plot twists and overall whodunits, and even though her style has been copied over and over to where her books may not seem like such a surprise anymore, it's important to keep in mind that she was the one who did them first. Now, if by some chance you've never heard of the book and you don't know what it's about, essentially a group of people are invited to this island, this house for the weekend for a soiree party kind of thing. And the person who invites them, it comes out that none of these people actually know who their hosts are, and they figure that out while talking to one another because their host never shows up. Slowly but surely, each of them starts dying off. And what's really interesting about this one is that Agatha Christie always writes a cast of characters so well. Each character has their own fleshed out backstory, and you're never confused despite the fact that she features, 10, 11, 12 characters, which I really appreciate. Next up is Magpie Murders by Anthony Horowitz. This book features a book editor who was assigned to edit a manuscript from the publishing house's more well-known authors. Even though the guy is a recluse, he's written all of these bestsellers and he has a reputation for being really difficult to work with. So this woman gets saddled with dealing with him and reading his next book, and as she reads the book, even though it's intriguing, she can't help but feel like there is an underlying message in the manuscript that she's editing. So needless to say, things become dark and she falls deeper and deeper into this intrigue, trying to figure out what's real and what's not. And I would say that this book is very atmospheric. The description and imagery really lends itself to that cooler weather, getting dark early at night kind of vibe. So definitely check it out if that seems like something that you're into. Like I said, obviously it's right up my alley. Next we have The Crow Girl by Eric Axel Sund. This one's definitely dark. A detective and a psychologist who team up together to find the person responsible for a series of killings. Now, the first body that they discover, the hands and the feet are covered with laceration, and it's clear that this person died very gruesomely. So naturally, the pressure is on for the detective to figure out who is behind all of these murders, which is where the psychologist comes in. They want to get inside the mind of a killer, figure out what makes them tick so that they can either anticipate the next person or cut him off before he or she kills anyone else. This one is interesting because of the layer of mystery in it. I know sometimes in thrillers such as the Jeffrey Deaver books, you know who the killer is because you're seeing things from their point of view and it's more of a cat and mouse game. This particular one is a mystery involved because you know less about the killer, and so it's even more interesting to follow along with the detective to figure out the clues as he stumbles across them to put all of the pieces together. Last up, we have Child of God by Cormac McCarthy. Now, this book is gruesome. We are following a character called Lester Ballard, who was falsely accused of rape, and when he's let out of jail, he takes up residence in the Tennessee countryside and essentially proceeds to lose his shit. He kills people in gruesome ways, he skins people, he just does all kinds of depraved things, and this one is different because it's not necessarily a whodunit or tracking down a killer. You know exactly who it is, and you are along on the ride with him as he goes and just does all of these just wretched things to various people. Now, I will admit, this is the only Cormac McCarthy book that I've ever read, but from what I've heard, he's very lyrical with his prose, and despite the gruesomeness of the subject matter for this particular book, I can definitely see that. Now, I know that's interesting to say because how can a book about a guy going around scalping people be beautifully written? But that's Cormac McCarthy for you. His brilliance shines through because he somehow manages to turn these just really horrific scenes into just, I can't even describe it. Definitely check this one out if you want something a lot more gruesome. It's definitely more hardcore than, say, And Then There Were None. But if that is your jam, by all means, this is the book for you. Okay, there you have it. So there's a list of serial killer, thriller, horrific books for you guys. Again, this whole series was inspired by the My Favorite Murder podcast, which, like I said before, I have been binge listening to. Now that we're coming into the darker, cooler months, I know that my TBR lists tend to lean more towards books that are more darker in nature. So I hope if you're just like me, this list has given you some ideas. Like I said before, if you've read any of these, let me know, or if you have your own recommendations, I would love to hear them in the comments. Until next time, guys, bye!